Welcome! Tonight's story is about the Indus Valley Civilization, the largest civilization in the ancient world, bigger than Egypt and Mesopotamia combined, a civilization that built the first planned cities in human history, the first sewage systems, the first standardized weights and measures, and then vanished so completely that the world forgot it existed for nearly 4,000 years. Take a deep breath. Let your body settle. Let the weight of the day leave your shoulders. Tonight, we travel to the banks of the Indus River, to cities that were already ancient when the pyramids were young, to streets that were perfectly straight when the rest of the world was still building mud huts, to a civilization so sophisticated and so mysterious that archaeologists who have spent their entire careers studying it will tell you, with complete honesty, that they still do not fully understand it. This is a slow journey, a quiet one. There is no rush tonight, and if these stories bring you peace, if they help you rest and carry you gently into sleep, we would love for you to subscribe and turn on notifications so every new story finds its way to you. Leave us a comment, suggest a historical civilization you would like us to explore. Your words guide what we create. Now, breathe and let the river carry you. In 1856, a group of British engineers were building a railway line across what is now the Punjab region of Pakistan. They needed ballast, the crushed stone and rubble that railway lines are built upon, the material that stabilizes the track and allows trains to run smoothly. And ballast in the 19th century was often sourced from whatever was available locally. Broken brick, crushed stone, the rubble of old buildings. The engineers noticed something. Across the flat plain of the Punjab, there were mounds. Low, irregular rises in the landscape, barely noticeable, easily dismissed as natural features of the terrain. But when the workers began to dig into these mounds, they found brick. Old brick, fired brick of remarkable quality, hard, well-made, precisely dimensioned, millions of them, enough to lay more than 100 miles of railway track. The workers dug and loaded. The engineers oversaw the operation. The railway was built, and in the process, they unknowingly quarried the ruins of one of the oldest cities in human history. A city that had been dead for nearly 4,000 years, whose bricks had been waiting in the earth all that time, whose streets and walls and drainage channels were broken apart and spread beneath the iron rails of the 19th century British Empire. Not one person involved understood what they were destroying, because nobody knew it was there. The civilization that those railway workers unknowingly dismantled is called today the Indus Valley Civilization, or sometimes the Harappan civilization, after Harappa, one of its two great cities, the ruins of which were the first to be identified and excavated by modern archaeologists. It flourished from approximately 3,300 BCE to 1300 BCE, a span of 2,000 years during which it built cities, developed trade networks that reached from Afghanistan to the Persian Gulf, created a writing system that remains undeciphered to this day, and achieved a standard of urban planning and public infrastructure that the Western world would not match for another 3,000 years. At its height, around 2600 to 1900 BCE, the Indus Valley Civilization was the largest civilization on Earth, larger than Egypt, larger than Mesopotamia, covering an area of approximately 1.25 million square kilometers, roughly the size of modern Pakistan and northwestern India combined, and containing a population that modern estimates place at somewhere between 1 and 5 million people spread across more than 1,000 settlements ranging from small villages to cities of tens of thousands, and almost nobody has heard of it. Not because the evidence is thin, though it is frustratingly incomplete in certain crucial ways, not because the sites are inaccessible, though some are remote, but because the Indus Valley Civilization left no pyramids, No colossal statues, no gold-filled tombs, no epic literature, no kings whose names we know, no gods whose stories we can read. It left cities, extraordinarily well-planned, carefully constructed, meticulously maintained cities, with straight streets and brick houses and public baths and drainage systems and standardized weights, that sat in the earth for 4,000 years, waiting for someone to understand what they meant. This is the story of the Indus Valley Civilization, the greatest civilization you have never been taught about, the ancient world's most profound mystery, and the city that built the future, then disappeared into the ground. To understand the Indus Valley Civilization, you must first understand the landscape that produced it. And the landscape is, in the most precise geographic sense, extraordinary. The Indian subcontinent, the great triangular landmass that juts southward from Asia into the Indian Ocean, is defined in its northern reaches by two of the most dramatic geographic features on Earth. To the north, the Himalayas, the highest mountain range in the world, a wall of rock and ice and altitude that separates the subcontinent from the rest of Asia with a thoroughness that no other mountain range on Earth can match. The Himalayas are not merely tall mountains, they are a climatic boundary, the barrier that deflects the monsoon rains southward and westward, that creates the distinctive seasonal rhythms of the subcontinent, that makes the rivers of northern India possible. And it is the rivers that matter most, the Himalayas and the other great ranges of Central Asia, the Karakoram, the Hindu Kush, the Pamir, collect the winter snowfall of an enormous catchment area and release it slowly through the summer months into a network of rivers that flow southward and westward across the plains of what are now Pakistan and northwestern India. The Indus River, called Sindhu in Sanskrit, from which the words India and Hindu ultimately derive, rises in the Tibetan plateau, flows northwestward through the mountains of Kashmir, then turns sharply south and runs the length of modern Pakistan before emptying into the Arabian Sea near what is now Karachi. The Gagahakra, a river system that was larger and more important in ancient times than it is today, possibly the remnant of the legendary Sarasvati River described in ancient Indian texts, flowed parallel to the Indus through the region that is now the Indian state of Rajasthan and the Pakistani province of Sindh. Together, these rivers and their tributaries created a floodplain of extraordinary agricultural potential. The annual floods of the Indus, fed by the Himalayan snowmelt and the monsoon rains, deposited fertile silt across the plain each year, renewing the soil, maintaining the productivity of the agricultural land without the intensive labor of irrigation that the farmers of Egypt and Mesopotamia required. You did not have to dig canals and manage water flow with the obsessive precision of Mesopotamian agriculture. The river came to you, it watered your fields, it left its silt and retreated, and then you planted. This was not an accident of geography. It was the foundation of a civilization with a reliable agricultural surplus, with more food than the immediate population needed, could afford specialists. People who did not farm, people who made pottery, who worked metal, who built ships, who administered the affairs of a growing community, who traded with distant places for the materials that the local landscape did not provide. The Indus Valley Civilization was built on the productivity of the river flood, but it was also shaped by the specific character of the Indus landscape in ways that go beyond simple agricultural productivity. The lower Indus Valley, the region called Sindh in modern Pakistan, is a landscape of flat, wide plains broken by the river itself and by the channels and oxbow lakes that the river creates in its wandering across the floodplain. The climate is hot and dry for much of the year, with the critical exception of the monsoon season, when the rains arrive and the river rises and the agricultural cycle begins. This landscape is not obviously hospitable. The summers are brutal. temperatures regularly exceeding 45 degrees Celsius, the air dry and relentless, the sun reflecting off the white salt flats that form where the river water evaporates. The winters are mild but short. The spring and autumn, the transition seasons, are brief. And yet, the productivity of the Indus flood plain, when the river was flooding regularly and the agricultural system was functioning, was sufficient to feed populations far larger than modern visitors to the region might expect. The ancient Indus Valley was greener than the modern landscape suggests. The degradation of the natural environment through 4,000 years of subsequent human activity has made the region drier and more barren than it was when the great cities were built. The ancient Indus Valley had forests, it had rainfall, it had the particular microclimate of a great river system, the moisture generated by the river itself, the vegetation that the river's water table sustained even between flood seasons, the specific ecological richness of a well-watered corridor through an otherwise semi-arid landscape. This was not a paradise, but it was a viable foundation for complex civilization. And the people who built that civilization were sophisticated enough to read the landscape accurately and build their cities and their agricultural systems in the places and in the ways that the land best supported. The Indus Valley Civilization did not appear suddenly. Nothing in human history appears suddenly, however dramatic the archaeological record sometimes makes it seem. Every civilization is the product of a long preparation. Generations, centuries, sometimes millennia, of incremental development, of accumulated knowledge, of social and technological experiments that mostly failed and occasionally succeeded. The preparation for the Indus Valley Civilization began approximately 7,000 years before the Common Era, 9,000 years ago, in a region of the foothills at the western edge of the Indus Plain, in what is now the Balochistan province of modern Pakistan. The site is called Mehrgarh. Mehrgarh is not famous. It should be. It is one of the most important archaeological sites in the world, the earliest known farming village in South Asia, and the location where, over the course of 4,000 years, the cultural and technological foundations of the later Indus Valley Civilization were slowly assembled. The earliest occupation at Mehrgarh dates to approximately 7,000 BCE. The people who lived there at this point were early farmers, cultivating wheat and barley, herding cattle and goats and sheep, living in mud brick houses in a settlement that was small by later standards but large by the standards of its time and place. What makes Mehrgarh particularly significant is the evidence of continuous occupation and development across an extraordinarily long time span. The site was occupied more or less continuously for approximately 5,000 years, from 7,000 BCE to approximately 2,500 BCE, when the full Indus Valley Civilization was already established on the plains below. In those 5,000 years, the people of Mehrgarh and the related communities of the Balochistan foothills were, in effect, inventing the components of urban civilization one by one. They developed pottery, first simple hand-formed vessels, then wheel-thrown ceramics of increasing sophistication, eventually the distinctive painted pottery styles that would become one of the most recognizable signatures of the Indus Valley cultural tradition. They developed metallurgy, working copper into tools and ornaments, gradually accumulating the knowledge of smelting and casting that would eventually support the sophisticated metalwork of the mature Indus cities. They developed cotton cultivation. The Mehrgarh evidence includes some of the earliest known cotton in the world, suggesting that the domestication of cotton, the fiber that would clothe the ancient world and eventually become one of the most important agricultural products in human history, may have occurred in this region, in these communities, in this long preparatory period. They developed dental medicine. The skeletal remains from Mehrgarh include individuals with teeth that show evidence of deliberate drilling, the earliest known dental work in human history. Someone in Mehrgar, 9,000 years ago, was extracting decayed material from teeth with a flint drill. And they developed the social complexity, the hierarchies, the specializations, the administrative conventions that would eventually support the construction of cities. The transition from the Mehrgar culture to the early Indus Valley Civilization was gradual and is still imperfectly understood by archaeologists. Between approximately 3,300 and 2,600 BCE, a period sometimes called the early Harappan phase, the settlements of the Indus Plain grew rapidly in size and sophistication. The material culture became increasingly standardized across a wide geographic area, and the architectural and urban forms that would characterize the mature civilization began to emerge. What drove this acceleration? What turned a collection of farming villages into a civilization of planned cities covering more than 1 million square kilometers? The honest answer is that we do not know in detail. The mechanisms of civilizational emergence, the social and economic and political processes that transform villages into cities, are not directly visible in the archaeological record. We can see the results, we can infer the processes from the evidence of what the results look like. But the specific decisions, the specific individuals, the specific moments of innovation that drove the transformation, these are lost in the silence of a pre-literate record. What we can say is that by approximately 2600 BCE, something extraordinary had been built on the plains of the Indus, something the world had never seen before. There is a name that every student of ancient history should know, and that almost none do: Mohenjo Daro. In the Sindhi language, the name means something like Mound of the Dead, a name given to the site by the modern inhabitants of the region, referring to the great earthen mound that rises above the flat plain of the lower Indus Valley, under which the ruins of the ancient city lay hidden. The mound rises about 12 meters above the surrounding plain. It is visible from some distance, a low, irregular hill in a landscape that is otherwise completely flat, its surface covered with the debris of centuries of occupation and abandonment. Today, a Buddhist stupa from the 2nd century CE sits on top of it. A later religious structure built on top of a much older one, the way that sacred places often accumulate layers of devotion across time. Modern archaeologists excavating beneath the stupa and through the mound have revealed one of the most extraordinary urban sites in the ancient world. At its height, approximately 2,500 to 2000 BCE, Mohenjo Daro covered an area of approximately 250 hectares, about 2.5 square kilometers. By ancient standards, this was a large city. Its population has been estimated at somewhere between 40,000 and 80,000 people, a substantial urban community for its time, comparable in scale to the great cities of contemporary Mesopotamia. But what the archaeologists found when they excavated Mohenjo Daro was not simply a large ancient city, it was a planned city. And that word, planned, carries implications that the modern visitor to the site, standing on the excavated ruins and looking out across the exposed street grid, can feel immediately and viscerally. The streets of Mohenjo Daro run straight, not approximately straight, not straight in the way that a winding path straightens over time as people take the shortest route between 2 points. Geometrically, precisely, intentionally straight, laid out according to a plan, oriented to the cardinal directions, forming a grid that covered the entire city with a regularity that implies, unmistakably, a single, organizing intelligence behind the design. The main streets of Mohenjo Daro are approximately 10 meters wide enough for 2 carts to pass each other, wide enough for a market to function, wide enough that the city could breathe and move and conduct its business without the cramped, congested chaos of the typical ancient city. Narrower streets ran between the main arteries at regular intervals, giving access to the residential blocks, rectangular islands of housing defined by the street grid, each block containing multiple individual houses arranged around internal courtyards. The houses of Mohenjo Daro are among the most revealing features of the site because of what they tell us about the standard of living of ordinary people in this ancient city. A typical Mohenjo Daro house was built from fired brick, not the sun-dried mud brick of most contemporary ancient construction, but brick fired in kilns, harder and more durable and more water-resistant, the kind of brick that could survive the annual Indus floods without dissolving back into mud. The bricks were made to a standard size, a ratio of 1 to 2 to 4, width to height to length, that was consistent across the entire civilization, from Mohenjo Daro in the south to Harappa in the north, from the smallest village to the largest city. Someone, some authority, some convention had decided that bricks should be made to this specific proportion, and the decision had been implemented across an area the size of Western Europe. The house was built around a central courtyard, an open space that provided light and air to the rooms arranged around it, that served as the social center of the household, the place where the family gathered and worked and cooked and entertained. The rooms were well proportioned, the walls were thick, providing insulation against the brutal Indus summer heat. The doorways opened onto the side lanes rather than the main streets, a privacy preference that made the residential blocks quiet and protected from the noise and traffic of the main thoroughfares. And the house had a bathroom, not a metaphorical bathroom, a real bathroom, a dedicated room with a carefully laid brick floor, sloped to drain, connected to the city's drainage system by a covered channel that ran beneath the street and connected to the main sewer. The drainage and sewage system of Mohenjo Daro is by any measure one of the greatest engineering achievements of the ancient world, and it is almost never discussed in the same breath as the pyramids or the ziggurats or the other monuments of ancient civilization. Perhaps because sewage systems are not glamorous, perhaps because they speak of practical competence rather than monumental ambition. But consider what this system represents. Every house in Mohenjo Daro was connected to a city-wide drainage network. The wastewater from bathrooms and kitchens flowed through covered channels beneath the floors of the houses, into covered channels beneath the lanes, into larger covered channels beneath the main streets, and ultimately out of the city entirely. Away from the residential areas, away from the water sources, away from the places where people lived and worked. The channels were covered with removable brick inspection covers, so that workers could access the system to clear blockages and perform maintenance. The system distinguished between wastewater and solid waste. Different channels for different types of effluent, reflecting an understanding of the public health implications of waste management that was not matched in Europe until the 19th century of the Common Era. Rome, the civilization that built the famous Cloaca Maxima, the great sewer that the world often cites as the first example of urban sanitation, was not founded until approximately 753 BCE. Its sewer system was not built until several centuries after that. The sewers of Mohenjo Daro were functioning 2,000 years before Rome existed. The citizens of Mohenjo Daro had clean water, drainage, and sanitation, the basic public health infrastructure of a functioning urban civilization, at a time when the ancestors of the Romans were still living in Iron Age villages. 600 kilometers to the northeast of Mohenjo Daro, on the banks of the Ravi River, one of the tributaries of the Indus system, stood the other great city of the Indus Valley Civilization, Harappa. The city that gave the civilization its alternative name, the Harappan civilization, was, like Mohenjo Daro, a large, carefully planned urban center. Its ruins were the first to attract systematic archaeological attention in the 1920s, and it was through Harappa that the modern world first began to understand that something extraordinary had existed in the ancient Indus Valley. Harappa was approximately the same size as Mohenjo Daro, covering roughly 150 hectares, with a population estimated at 20,000 to 80,000 people. Like Mohenjo Daro, it was built on a grid plan with standardized bricks with drainage systems, with public buildings and residential quarters and specialized craft areas. But Harappa had something that distinguished it from Mohenjo Daro, and that has generated more archaeological discussion than almost any other feature of either site: the granaries, or rather, the large, carefully constructed platforms and buildings that the early excavators identified as granaries, and that have since been reinterpreted multiple times as the evidence has been reassessed. The structures in question are a series of large raised platforms in the northern part of the city, massive constructions of fired brick elevated above the surrounding ground level, with evidence of the kind of careful ventilation and access control that would make sense for a large-scale food storage facility. Whether these were actually granaries, storage facilities for the agricultural surplus that fed the city's population, or whether they served some other function, religious, administrative, industrial, is still debated. The evidence is ambiguous enough that confident identification remains elusive. But the structure's existence tells us something important regardless of their specific function. Harappa had large-scale, centrally organized facilities for managing significant quantities of material, grain, goods, or both. The workers' quarters at Harappa are among the most socially revealing features of any Indus Valley site. In the southern area of the city, archaeologists have found a neighborhood of smaller, more modestly constructed houses. Arranged in rows, their layout regular and somewhat repetitive in a way that suggests planned construction rather than organic growth. Associated with this neighborhood are large working platforms, circular constructions of brick that appear to have been used for processing grain, with the remains of grain husks still present in the archaeological deposits. These were, most likely, the homes and workplaces of the laborers who worked in the city's productive industries, the people who processed the agricultural surplus, who made the pottery and the textiles and the other goods that Harappan commerce required. What is significant about the workers' quarters at Harappa is what they suggest about the social organization of the city. The houses are small, modest by the standards of the larger Harappan residences found elsewhere at the site. They do not have the courtyard plans and multiple rooms of the more affluent areas, but they are built of the same fired brick, laid to the same standards, connected to the same drainage system. They are decent houses, not the hovels of a brutally exploited underclass, but the adequate housing of workers who were part of a functioning urban system. The Indus Valley Civilization does not appear, from the archaeological evidence, to have had the extreme social stratification of contemporary Egypt or Mesopotamia. The vast gulf between the palace and the peasant, the god-king and the slave, that characterized the riverine civilizations to the west. There were differences in wealth. Some houses are clearly larger and more elaborately appointed than others. Some individuals were buried with more grave goods than others. Some people ate better than others, as the skeletal evidence reveals. But there are no palaces at Harappa or Mohenjo Daro, no pyramids, no royal tombs of the kind that announce unmistakably the presence of a ruler whose power was so absolute that the entire productive capacity of the civilization could be mobilized to glorify their memory. The rulers of the Indus Valley Civilization, whoever they were, whatever their titles, however they governed, did not leave monuments to themselves. This is one of the most puzzling and most fascinating aspects of the Indus mystery. At the center of Mohenjo Daro, on the elevated platform that archaeologists call the Citadel Mound, the higher western portion of the city that appears to have housed its most important public buildings, there is a structure that has captivated every archaeologist who has studied it. It is called simply the Great Bath. It is not metaphorically great. It is literally a large bathing pool, approximately 12 meters long, 7 meters wide, and 2.4 meters deep, constructed with a precision and a care that speaks unmistakably of great importance. The pool itself is lined with carefully fitted fired brick, laid in 2 layers with a layer of bitumen between them, the natural tar that seeps from the ground in parts of the ancient Near East, used here as a waterproofing agent to make the pool watertight. The floor is made of the same brick and bitumen construction. Stairways descend into the pool from both ends. Around the pool, a series of rooms, some of which may have been changing rooms or storage rooms, is arranged on a raised walkway that surrounds the pool on all sides. The entire structure is designed for one purpose: controlled immersion in clean water. The pool was filled and emptied through a system of inlets and drains connected to the city's water and sewage infrastructure. The water in the pool was, in other words, not stagnant. It was managed. It could be refreshed as needed. What was the Great Bath for? The honest archaeological answer is we do not know with certainty. But the most compelling hypothesis, supported by the structural features of the pool and by the parallels with later South Asian religious traditions, is that the Great Bath was a place of ritual purification. The concept of ritual bathing, of immersion in water as a means of spiritual cleansing, of preparation for religious ceremony, of maintaining the purity required for contact with the sacred, is deeply rooted in South Asian religious traditions. The tradition of ritual bathing in sacred rivers that is central to Hinduism, the great bathing festivals, the daily ablutions that devout Hindus perform at river ghats, the theological importance of cleanliness as a prerequisite for religious practice, may trace its origins in some form to practices that were already ancient in the Indus Valley Civilization. If the Great Bath was indeed a place of ritual purification, then it was a public facility, a space that served the community's religious needs rather than the private devotions of an elite. Not a palace chapel, not a royal sanctuary, a public bath for the city's population to use in the conduct of their religious life. This would be consistent with what the rest of the archaeological evidence suggests about Indus Valley society. A civilization that invested in public infrastructure, in sewers and drainage and clean water and standardized weights, rather than in monuments to individual power. A civilization that served its citizens rather than merely extracting from them. Of all the mysteries that the Indus Valley Civilization presents to modern scholarship, and there are many, none is more tantalizing, none more frustrating, and none more consequential than the mystery of the Indus script the Indus people wrote. We know this because they left behind more than 4,000 inscribed objects, primarily small square or rectangular seals made from a soft stone called steatite, carved with signs and images. These seals are found across the entire geographic extent of the Indus cultural area, and they have also been found at sites in Mesopotamia and the Persian Gulf. Physical evidence of the long-distance trade connections that the Indus civilization maintained. The script on these seals consists of approximately 400 to 600 distinct signs. The precise number depends on how you define and count variants, arranged in lines, usually running from right to left. These signs have been studied by scholars for nearly 100 years, and they have not been deciphered, not partially deciphered, not tentatively cracked, not read with any degree of scholarly consensus. The Indus script remains, after a century of intensive effort by some of the finest minds in the field of linguistics and ancient writing systems, completely unreadable. The reasons for this failure are real and significant, and understanding them helps appreciate the depth of the problem. First, no bilingual text. The key to deciphering most ancient scripts has been the existence of a bilingual inscription, a text written in both the unknown script and a known language, which allows the decoder to work out the correspondence between the two systems. The Rosetta Stone, with its parallel texts in Egyptian hieroglyphic, Demotic script, and Greek, provided the key to hieroglyphic decipherment. The Behistun inscription, with its parallel texts in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian cuneiform, provided the key to cuneiform decipherment. No such bilingual text exists for the Indus script. Despite decades of searching and the examination of every inscribed object from every Indus site, nothing has been found that contains Indus script alongside a text in a known language. Without a bilingual text, decipherment is extraordinarily difficult, essentially a matter of inferring the structure and content of an unknown language from purely internal evidence without any external anchor. Second, the texts are short. The average Indus inscription consists of only 5 signs. The longest known Indus inscription contains approximately 26 signs. These are very short texts, too short to provide the statistical patterns that computational analysis needs to work with, too short to reveal the grammatical structure of the language, too short to confirm or refute any specific proposed reading. By comparison, the Egyptian texts that Champollion used to decipher hieroglyphics were thousands of signs long. The Mesopotamian cuneiform texts were similarly extensive. 5 signs are simply not enough to work with. Third, the underlying language is unknown. Even if the script were partially deciphered, we would still need to know what language it represents. And the language of the Indus people, the language or languages spoken in the great cities, is not known. Several candidates have been proposed. The most widely discussed is the Dravidian hypothesis, the suggestion that the Indus peoples spoke an early form of the Dravidian language family that today includes Tamil, Telugu, Kannada, and Malayalam, spoken primarily in southern India. This hypothesis has some supporting arguments, including the geographic distribution of Dravidian languages and certain linguistic features. Other scholars have proposed connections to other language families, to the Indo-Aryan family, to the Munda languages of central India, to entirely unrelated language families. No consensus has been reached. The underlying language question remains, like the script itself, unresolved. What the Indus script looks like is worth describing because the visual character of the signs tells us something even before we can read them. The signs are varied. Some are clearly pictographic, representing recognizable objects, fish, jars, human figures, animals. Others are more abstract, geometric forms that have no obvious pictorial referent. The combination of pictographic and abstract signs is consistent with a writing system that is in an intermediate stage of development, not purely pictographic, not fully abstract and phonetic, but somewhere in between. The seals on which the script appears typically combine text with images, a carved animal usually, below or beside the text. The animals are rendered with extraordinary skill and naturalistic accuracy. The humped bull, zebu, the elephant, the rhinoceros, the tiger, the crocodile, the unicorn, a single-horned animal that appears to be a conventionalized representation of a bull in profile, each carved with a precision that speaks of an established artistic tradition with its own conventions and its own standards. The seals themselves were likely used for commercial purposes, pressing into clay sealings that authenticated the contents of bales and containers of trade goods. Each seal probably identified its owner, a merchant perhaps, or a trading house, but the texts on the seals may contain more than just names. They may contain titles or formulas or messages of some kind, They may contain the names of gods or the invocations of religious power. They may record transactions or assert ownership of something beyond the immediate seal and its goods. We do not know. 4,000 inscribed objects, 400 signs, 100 years of scholarship, and silence. The Indus Valley Civilization is speaking to us across 4,000 years of time, and we cannot understand a word it says. The Indus seals are, despite the frustration of their unreadable script, among the most extraordinary small objects in the ancient world. They are typically between 2 and 5 centimeters square, small enough to hold in the palm of a hand, small enough to carry in a pocket, or hang from a cord around the neck. They are carved from steatite, a soft stone that was available in the region and that, when fired after carving, hardened to a white, chalk-like material that took and held the carved detail with remarkable precision. The carving technique was extraordinary. The seal carvers of the Indus Valley were among the finest miniature artists in the ancient world. Working at a scale of a few centimeters, they created images of animals that are not merely recognizable. They are alive. The humped bull on the Indus seals is rendered with the specific posture and musculature of a real bull. The slight forward lean of the massive head, the way the dewlap hangs, the curve of the back. The elephant shows the texture of the skin, the curve of the trunk, the specific way an elephant holds its ears. These are images made by people who had spent a great deal of time looking at these animals very carefully. Images made by artists who had a technical tradition and aesthetic standards of a high order. The most famous of the Indus seals is the one that archaeologists call the Pashupati seal, found at Mohenjo Daro, now housed in the National Museum of Pakistan in Karachi. It shows a seated figure, human, with what appear to be horns or a horned headdress, surrounded by animals, an elephant, a tiger, a rhinoceros, a buffalo, and 2 deer beneath the figure's throne. The pose of the figure, seated in what appears to be a yoga-like position, with the feet together and the knees spread outward, is striking because it resembles postures associated with meditation in later South Asian religious traditions. The figure's association with wild animals, surrounded by them, apparently presiding over them, has led some scholars to identify this image as an early representation of a deity associated with animals and the natural world. The comparison to the later Hindu god Shiva, in his aspect as Pashupati, lord of animals, is suggestive, hence the seal's modern name. Whether the identification is correct, whether this is indeed an early image of a deity who was the ancestor of Shiva in the later Hindu tradition, is debated. The seal could represent a deity, a priest in ceremonial costume, a mythological figure, or something else entirely. But the image is unmistakably powerful. A human figure surrounded by the great animals of the natural world, apparently commanding or presiding over them. It speaks of a relationship between the human and the natural that is both ancient and immediately comprehensible. Other seals show composite creatures, animals with human elements, humans with animal elements, the fantastic combinations of different animal features that are found in the mythological art of cultures across the ancient world. These composite beings are the visual vocabulary of a religious or mythological tradition whose specific narratives we cannot reconstruct. A deity with the horns of a bull and the body of a human, a figure half human, half tiger, an animal whose body combines the features of 2 different species. These images are the pictures of a mythology, a system of stories about the gods and the world that we cannot read. The images are the illustrations of a text that was never written down, or was written in the undeciphered script, or has been entirely lost. The mythology of the Indus Valley Civilization is gone. What remains are its illustrations, scattered across the seals, waiting for someone to understand the stories they depict. The Indus Valley Civilization was not an isolated world. It was connected, through trade networks of remarkable extent, to the civilizations of Mesopotamia, of the Persian Gulf, of Afghanistan and Central Asia, and the Arabian Peninsula. The evidence for these connections is physical and specific. Indus seals have been found at Lagash, and other Mesopotamian cities. The square steatite seals, with their characteristic script and animal imagery, turning up in the ruins of cities thousands of kilometers from the Indus plain. They were there because Indus merchants were there, or because goods from the Indus were arriving with their identifying marks. Mesopotamian texts, the cuneiform clay tablets of the great Mesopotamian cities, mention a place called Meluha as a source of valued trade goods: carnelian beads, ivory, timber, gold, certain types of animal. The identification of Meluha with the Indus Valley Civilization, proposed by scholars in the 1970s and now widely accepted, means that the Mesopotamians knew about the Indus Civilization, traded with it, and valued its products. The specific goods that the Indus Valley exported to Mesopotamia can be partially reconstructed from both the Mesopotamian textual references and the archaeological evidence of Indus-style objects found in Mesopotamian contexts. Carnelian beads made from the red, semi-precious stone that was available in the mountains of Gujarat and Rajasthan were among the most valued Indus exports. Indus craftsmen had developed specific techniques for producing carnelian beads of a distinctive form and a distinctive surface treatment, etched white patterns on the red stone that are immediately recognizable and have been found at sites across the Persian Gulf and into Mesopotamia. Ivory from the elephants of the Indian subcontinent, but it was another valuable export. Ivory combs and ivory inlays of Indus workmanship have been found at Persian Gulf sites. Cotton textiles. The Indus Valley was, as we noted, among the earliest regions to cultivate cotton. Indus cotton cloth was likely exported in quantities that have left no direct archaeological trace, given the perishability of textiles. But the Mesopotamian textual references to specific types of cloth associated with Meluha are consistent with the export of Indian cotton to the Persian Gulf trading world. The weights and measures of the Indus Valley Civilization are, from the perspective of commercial history, one of its most significant achievements. Indus merchants used a system of standardized stone weights, carefully shaped cubes and hemispheres of polished chert, a fine-grained stone that could be worked to precise dimensions, that formed a consistent system of measurement. The system was binary in its lower values. Each weight was double the previous one and decimal in its higher values. It was consistent across the entire geographic extent of the Indus cultural area. The same weights, made to the same standards, in Mohenjo Daro and Harappa, and the smaller sites scattered across thousands of kilometers. This standardization was not accidental. It was the product of a deliberate policy, an agreement enforced somehow across a vast area that commercial transactions would use these specific weights and no others. The practical implication was enormous. A merchant from Mohenjo Daro traveling to Harappa or to one of the smaller Indus towns did not need to worry about whether the weights used in that place would be different from the ones he was accustomed to. The weights were the same everywhere. The system was reliable. Trade could be conducted with confidence. This was a foundational requirement for a functioning commercial economy at any scale. And the Indus Valley Civilization had achieved it 3,000 years before the European states that we typically associate with commercial sophistication. The measuring rods found at Indus sites, carefully calibrated instruments for measuring length, show the same commitment to standardization. The Indus unit of length, reconstructed from the measuring rods, appears to have been approximately 1.32 meters, a unit that was consistent across sites and that was used in the laying out of city plans and the construction of buildings. The straight streets of Mohenjo Daro were not merely straight. They were measurably straight, laid out using the standardized measuring system, their dimensions conforming to the consistent unit of measurement that the civilization had adopted. The Indus cities were built to specification. The two great cities of Mohenjo Daro and Harappa are the best known and most extensively excavated Indus sites, but they are not the only remarkable urban centers that the civilization produced. Dholavira, located on the island of Kadir in the Rann of Kutch, in what is now the Indian state of Gujarat, is one of the most extraordinary archaeological sites in South Asia, and one of the least visited by tourists despite its extraordinary state of preservation. Dholavira was a major Indus city covering approximately 100 hectares, with a well-preserved street plan and a series of public buildings and residential areas that give a vivid picture of what an Indus city looked like in its prime. But what makes Dholavira uniquely remarkable is its water management system. The island of Kadir is surrounded by the Rann of Kutch, a vast, flat, salt desert that is flooded by the sea during the monsoon season and desiccated during the dry months. Fresh water on the island was scarce and seasonal. The rains that fell during the monsoon were the primary source of fresh water, and if that water was not captured and stored, it would flow off the island into the salt flats and be lost. The people of Dholavira built one of the most sophisticated water management systems in the ancient world to address this challenge. They constructed a series of reservoirs, large, carefully engineered storage tanks cut into the rock of the island, designed to capture the monsoon rainwater and store it for use during the dry season. The reservoirs were connected to a network of channels that collected runoff from the city's rooftops and streets and directed it into the storage system. The scale of the system was remarkable. The reservoirs at Dholavira collectively had a storage capacity estimated at approximately 100,000 cubic meters, enough water to sustain the city's population through a full dry season without access to any other water source. The engineering of the reservoirs was precise. The walls were built from carefully dressed stone, cut and fitted with a precision that allowed the tanks to hold water without significant seepage. The inlet and outlet channels were designed to allow the tanks to be filled during rains and drained for cleaning and maintenance. Dholavira also contains what may be the most dramatic single artifact of the Indus Valley Civilization, an object that has been called the world's first signboard. In 1990, excavators at Dholavira found, in the ruins of what appears to have been the main gateway of the city's northern entrance, 10 large signs made from gypsum, a white mineral, embedded in what appears to have been a wooden frame, creating a large display visible to anyone entering the city through the main gate. The signs are approximately 37 centimeters high and form a row approximately 3 meters long, a conspicuous display visible from a considerable distance, placed at the most important entry point of the city. Each sign contains a large Indus script character, the 10 signs together constituting what appears to be a 4-sign inscription displayed at monumental scale. What does it say? We do not know. The inscription is in the undeciphered Indus script, but its placement at the city gate, at monumental scale, where every visitor to Dholavira would see it, suggests that it was communicating something of public importance. A name, a proclamation, a religious invocation, a civic motto, the largest ancient inscription in the Indus script, placed where the entire world entering the city would see it, and we cannot read it. The mystery of the Indus Valley Civilization is present in every discovery the archaeologists make, in every artifact they uncover. The civilization is rich in physical evidence and frustratingly silent on meaning. In the coastal lowlands of what is now the Indian state of Gujarat, approximately 80 kilometers south of the modern city of Ahmedabad, there is a small mound in the flat agricultural plain. The mound is unimpressive by visual standards, low, irregular, not much higher than the surrounding fields. Cattle graze on its upper surface. A small road runs past it. Beneath the mound, the ruins of Lothal. Lothal was an Indus Valley city of moderate size, covering approximately 7 hectares, much smaller than Mohenjo Daro or Harappa or Dolavira. But it was not ordinary. Lothal was a port city. Specifically, it was the southernmost major Indus settlement, positioned on the estuary of a now-vanished river, at the edge of the Gulf of Kambat, the inlet of the Arabian Sea that provided access to the maritime trade routes of the Persian Gulf and the broader Indian Ocean world. And Lothal had a dock. The dock at Lothal, a large rectangular basin of fired brick, approximately 220 meters long and 37 meters wide, is, if the identification is correct, the oldest known artificial dock in the world. Built approximately 2400 BCE, it predates the next known artificial harbour structures by centuries. The dock was designed to allow boats to enter and exit regardless of the tidal state of the surrounding estuary. The walls were built to a height sufficient to hold water when the surrounding estuary level dropped at low tide, allowing the boats moored inside to remain afloat. Sluice gates, wooden gates that could be opened or closed to manage the water level, controlled the flow. Some scholars have challenged the identification of the Lothal structure as a dock, arguing that its dimensions and construction features are more consistent with a water reservoir than a harbour. The debate is ongoing, but the context of Lothal's position, a coastal trading city at the edge of the Gulf of Kambat, with evidence of extensive commercial activity and with Indus-style goods that parallel those found in Persian Gulf trading contexts, strongly suggests that the city was indeed a maritime commercial centre. And if it was a maritime commercial centre, it needed harbour facilities. The large brick basin, whatever its precise function, was the most prominent engineering feature of the city. The warehouse at Lothal, a large building with rows of platforms that appear to have served for storage, and the bead-making workshop where archaeologists found the tools and raw materials of the carnelian bead industry, confirm that Lothal was a manufacturing and trading centre, not merely a residential settlement. The carnelian beads made in Lothal were exactly the type found at Persian Gulf sites and in Mesopotamia, the distinctive etched carnelian beads that are the most recognizable artifact of Indus long-distance trade. Someone in Lothal was making these beads. They were being shipped, presumably by sea, to markets in the Persian Gulf and Mesopotamia. The workers of Lothal, sitting in their workshop on the edge of the Arabian Sea, were participants in the first global commercial network in human history. Trading with people they would never meet, in places they would never see, across distances that the technology of their time made barely manageable. The religious life of the Indus Valley Civilization is, like so much else about this civilization, known to us only partially and indirectly. There are no temples at Mohenjo Daro or Harappa, or at least no buildings that have been identified with confidence as temples. In the great civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt, the temple was the most prominent feature of the urban landscape. The largest, most elaborately constructed, most centrally positioned building in the city, the physical expression of the divine power that legitimated the entire social order. In the Indus cities, there is no such structure. The building that comes closest to monumental religious architecture is the Great Bath at Mohenjo Daro, and the identification of the Great Bath as a religious rather than simply hygienic facility is itself an inference, not a certainty. The absence of obvious temples, the kind of monument to institutional religious power that other ancient civilizations invariably produced, is one of the most puzzling features of the Indus archaeological record. Several explanations have been proposed. One possibility is that Indus religious practice was conducted in domestic rather than institutional settings, that the household was the primary locus of religious activity, with small household shrines and domestic rituals fulfilling the religious functions that in other civilizations were centralized in temples. Evidence of small figurines and ritual objects found in domestic contexts at Indus sites is consistent with this interpretation. Another possibility is that Indus religious architecture was built from perishable materials, wood and thatch rather than fired brick, and has therefore not survived in recognizable form. This is theoretically possible, but the Indus people demonstrably knew how to build in fired brick and did so for their domestic and public buildings. A decision to build religious structures differently from everything else would itself require explanation. A third possibility is that the Indus religious tradition was decentralized in ways that other ancient religions were not, that there was no priestly class that required monumental institutional expression, no state religion that demanded the visible demonstration of divine power through architecture. The figurines found at Indus sites are the most direct evidence we have for Indus religious practice, and they are numerous and varied. The most common figurine type is a female figure, typically depicted standing or seated, with elaborate hairstyles and jewelry, sometimes holding objects or performing gestures that have no obvious mundane explanation. These figurines are found across the entire Indus cultural area, in both urban and village contexts, in large numbers. The obvious comparison is with the mother goddess figurines found across the ancient world, from the Paleolithic period onward through the Neolithic and Bronze Age cultures of Europe and the Near East. The female figurine with elaborate adornment found in domestic contexts is one of the most widespread and most ancient forms of religious artifact in human culture. Were the Indus figurines representations of a goddess, a divine feminine principle associated with fertility and the earth and the productive capacity of nature? Possibly. The parallels with later South Asian goddess traditions are suggestive. Were they simply representations of human women, not deities, but portraits or toys or objects associated with social ritual rather than religious devotion? Also possible. Were some of them both? Images that blurred the boundary between the human and the divine in the way that many ancient religious traditions do? Quite possibly. The male figurines from Indus sites are less common but equally interesting. The small bronze figure known as the dancing girl from Mohenjo Daro, actually a young female, despite the traditional name, is one of the most famous objects from the entire Indus corpus, a small bronze figure of a girl, her right hand on her hip, her left arm covered in bangles, her posture confident and direct. She looks out of her 5-centimeter height with an expression of remarkable self-possession. This figure is not a goddess, she is a person, a specific individual rendered with the observational accuracy of an artist who knew real people and could capture the specific quality of a real presence. Whoever made the dancing girl was not making a religious icon, they were making a portrait. The Indus Valley Civilization had art that depicted real people in the real world with the specific accuracy of observation, not the formulaic conventions of a purely religious art tradition. Behind the ruins and the seals and the unreadable script there were people who woke up in the morning in their brick houses and went about the business of living, who cooked their food and tended their children and practiced their crafts and conducted their trade and argued with their neighbors and fell in love and grew old and died. We know some things about these people from the physical evidence of their bones, their teeth, their tools, their food remains, and the artifacts of their daily lives. The diet of Indus Valley people was varied by ancient standards. They ate wheat and barley, the staple grains of the region, grown on the floodplains of the Indus and its tributaries. They ate rice. Evidence of rice cultivation in the Indus Valley has been found at several sites, suggesting that this crop, which would eventually dominate South Asian agriculture, was already being grown during the Harappan period. They ate legumes, lentils and peas, the protein sources that complemented the grain-based diet. They ate cottonseed oil, pressed from the seeds of the cotton plant, which was cultivated primarily for its fiber, but whose seeds were a byproduct with their own nutritional value. They ate fish. In coastal sites like Lothal, fish bones are abundant in the excavation deposits, and even in the inland cities, fish from the river system supplemented the agricultural diet. They ate beef. Cattle bones with evidence of butchery are found at Indus sites, suggesting that cattle were slaughtered for food as well as used for labor and dairy. This is significant given the later Hindu tradition of cattle sanctity, the prohibition on beef eating that is a central feature of modern Hindu practice. The Indus evidence suggests that the cow did not have sacred status in the Harappan civilization, or at least that the prohibition on eating beef had not yet developed. They kept dogs. Dog bones are found at Indus sites, some in context that suggests the animals were companions rather than simply food sources. The dog is one of humanity's oldest companions, and the Indus people were clearly no exception to the universal human tendency to form relationships with this species. The health of Indus Valley people, as revealed by the skeletal evidence, was mixed, as it always is in ancient populations. Evidence of dental decay is present. The agricultural diet, heavy in carbohydrates, was not kind to teeth. But the Mehrgar evidence of dental drilling suggests that the people of the Indus cultural tradition had been attempting to address dental problems for thousands of years before the mature civilization. Evidence of tuberculosis and other infectious diseases appears in some skeletal remains. Diseases of dense population, the health costs of urban living that every ancient city paid. But the skeletal evidence also shows a population that was, by the standards of the ancient world, reasonably well nourished. The bones do not show the markers of severe nutritional deficiency that appear in populations on the edge of subsistence. The Indus people were generally getting enough to eat, a tribute to the productivity of the agricultural system that supported them. The life expectancy of Indus Valley people was probably in the range of 35 to 45 years at birth, a figure that sounds low by modern standards, but was typical of pre-modern agricultural societies, heavily influenced by high infant and child mortality rather than by adult longevity. An Indus Valley person who survived childhood could expect to live into their 40s or 50s, with exceptional individuals reaching older ages. The craftsmen of the Indus civilization were among the most skilled of the ancient world. The bead makers who produced the carnelian beads that traveled to Mesopotamia were working with extraordinary precision, drilling holes through hard stone using bow drills tipped with flint or with the mineral corundum, the same mineral in its gem quality forms that we call ruby and sapphire. The holes they drilled were smaller in diameter than a modern sewing needle, at the center of beads that were sometimes 5 centimeters long. This was not occasional craftsmanship. This was the product of a specialized professional tradition. Bead makers who learned their craft from masters who practiced it for their entire working lives, who passed it on to the next generation. The copper and bronze workers of the Indus civilization were equally skilled. The metalwork found at Indus sites shows sophisticated understanding of alloy composition and casting technique. The ability to produce objects with specific hardness and workability properties by adjusting the proportions of copper, tin, and other metals in the alloy. The textile workers, the weavers of cotton cloth who created the fabrics that traveled to Mesopotamia and the Persian Gulf, were invisible in the archaeological record in the way that perishable goods always are. But their product was known and valued across the ancient world, and the spindle whorls, the ceramic or stone weights used to control the spinning of thread, that are among the most common small finds at every Indus site, speak to the scale of textile production. Mohenjo Daro and Harappa were the great cities, the metropolitan centers of the Indus civilization, the places where the most extensive excavations have been conducted, and the most complete picture of Indus urban life has been assembled. But the Indus Valley Civilization was not just 2 cities, it was a civilization of more than 1,000 settlements, ranging in size from the great urban centers down through intermediate-sized towns of 20,000 to 30,000 people, to smaller market towns, to villages, to seasonal camps on the agricultural frontier. This settlement hierarchy, the graduated series of sites from the largest to the smallest, reflects a complex economic and social geography, a landscape organized around the movement of goods and people and the management of agricultural production across an enormous area. Rakhigarhi, located in the modern Indian state of Haryana, approximately 150 kilometers north of Delhi, is now recognized as potentially the largest Indus city, covering an area of approximately 350 hectares, larger than either Mohenjo Daro or Harappa. Excavations at Rakhigarhi have been relatively limited compared to the 2 great Pakistani sites, and the full extent and character of the site is still being determined. What Rakhigarhi has already provided is remarkable, including the skeletal remains of individuals who have been subjected to ancient DNA analysis, providing the most direct biological evidence yet of who the Indus Valley people were. Ganweriwala, in the Punjab province of Pakistan, on the course of the ancient Ghaggar-Hakra river system, is another large Indus site that has been identified from surface survey but not extensively excavated. It may have been a major city of comparable importance to Mohenjo Daro and Harappa. The distribution of major Indus cities across the landscape, Mohenjo Daro in the south, Harappa in the central Punjab, Dholavira on the western coast, Rakhigarhi and Ganweriwala in the east, reflects a settlement pattern spread across an enormous geographic area, connected by river systems and overland routes, and the commercial networks that linked the entire civilization together. The smaller sites of the Indus civilization are in many ways as revealing as the great cities, because they show how the civilization worked at a human scale away from the metropolitan centers. Aladino, a small site in the Sindh province of Pakistan, excavated in the 1970s, was a modest Indus town, a fraction of the size of Mohenjo Daro. But it used the same standardized bricks, the same drainage technology, the same weights and measures. It was, in every material respect, a member of the same civilization as the great cities. This standardization across scale, yet the fact that a small town used the same brick sizes and the same weights as the largest city, is one of the most striking features of the Indus civilization. It implies a degree of cultural integration, a shared identity and shared practice that extended across the entire geographic extent of the civilization. People in a small town in Sindh and people in a large city in Punjab were doing things the same way, using the same tools, building to the same standards, conducting commerce by the same conventions. How was this maintained? What enforced the standardization? What kept a town builder in a distant village using the same brick proportions as the master builders of Mohenjo Daro? These are questions about the political and administrative structure of the Indus civilization, and questions that connect directly to the mystery of who was in charge and how they governed. And they are questions that the archaeological evidence has not yet definitively answered. Of all the puzzles that the Indus Valley Civilization presents to modern scholarship, none is more fundamental than the question of governance. Who ruled the Indus cities? How was the civilization organized politically? What was the relationship between the great cities and the smaller settlements? How was the remarkable standardization of the material culture, the consistent brick sizes, the consistent weights, the consistent urban planning conventions, maintained across such a vast area? These questions are unanswerable with certainty from the available evidence, but the absence of certain expected features of ancient governance is itself highly significant. In Egypt, the ruler was unmistakable. The pharaoh was present everywhere in the material record, in the colossal statues, in the royal tombs filled with extraordinary wealth, in the inscriptions that recorded every significant act of the reign. Egyptian governance was visible, monumental, and unmistakably centered on the single divine ruler. In Mesopotamia, the king was similarly visible in the ziggurats that expressed the divine power of the city god who the king served, in the royal inscriptions that recorded military victories and building achievements, in the palace complexes that housed the royal household and the administrative machinery of the state. In the Indus Valley, there are no royal statues, no royal tombs of exceptional wealth, no inscriptions recording the victories of kings, no palace complexes identifiable as such. There is at Mohenjo Daro a building that some scholars have called a palace, a large, multi-roomed structure in the citadel area that is larger and more elaborate than the surrounding buildings, but it lacks the features that unambiguously identify a building as a royal residence. There are no throne rooms, no audience halls of the kind that Mesopotamian palatial architecture invariably contains. There is also a building that some scholars have called an assembly hall, a large room with rows of what may be seats arranged around a central space. If this identification is correct, it would suggest a form of collective governance, decisions made by an assembly rather than by a single ruler. But the identification is uncertain, and the building could have served other functions. The most common scholarly position today is that the Indus Valley Civilization was governed by some form of collective or oligarchic authority, perhaps a council of merchants, or of clan leaders, or of religious specialists, rather than by the single, divine monarch that most contemporary civilizations produced. This would be consistent with the material evidence, the lack of royal monuments, the absence of extreme wealth inequality in the burial record, the emphasis on public infrastructure rather than private luxury. All of these features suggest a society in which power was distributed rather than concentrated, in which governance served collective interests rather than individual aggrandizement. Whether this is what actually happened, whether the Indus Valley produced something like an early form of collective governance that later civilizations largely abandoned for monarchy, is one of the most fascinating open questions in the study of ancient political organization. The Indus Valley Civilization may have been not merely a technological achievement, but a political one. A civilization that found ways of organizing large urban populations and maintaining complex economic systems without the concentration of power in a single ruler that the ancient world generally found necessary. Or it may have had rulers whose monuments and records simply have not survived or have not been recognized. The incomplete excavation of the major sites, large portions of Mohenjo Daro and Harappa, remain unexcavated, leaves open the possibility that evidence of more conventional governance is waiting to be found. The mystery of Indus governance is unresolved. It may be unresolvable. Around 1900 BCE, approximately 4,000 years ago, something began to change in the Indus Valley Civilization. Not suddenly, not catastrophically, at least not in the way that the fall of Rome was catastrophic, or the destruction of Carthage, but unmistakably. The great cities began to change in ways that the archaeological record captures clearly, even if the causes behind the changes remain debated. The first signs are visible in the quality of the material culture. The fine, thin-walled pottery that characterizes the mature Harappan phase, thrown on the wheel to precise dimensions, fired at controlled temperatures, decorated with standardized painted designs, begins to give way to coarser, less carefully made ceramics. The craft standards that had been maintained with remarkable consistency across centuries begin to slip. The weights and measures, the standardized system that had been the backbone of Indus commercial integration, begin to show more variation. The carefully calibrated chert weights are replaced in some sites by cruder, less precisely made equivalents. The city planning deteriorates. New construction in the cities shows less attention to the grid plan and the drainage system that had distinguished the mature Harappan cities. buildings are put up in what were previously open spaces. The carefully maintained streets and public areas are encroached upon by new construction that ignores the urban planning principles of the earlier period. These are the signs of a civilization under stress. A civilization in which the administrative systems that had maintained the standards are weakening, in which the central authority, whatever it was, is losing its ability to enforce the conventions that had integrated the civilization. What caused the decline? This is one of the most actively debated questions in Indus Valley archaeology, and the honest answer is that we do not know with certainty, and that the decline was probably caused by multiple interacting factors rather than a single event. Climate change is the factor that has attracted the most attention in recent scholarship. The work of paleoclimatologists, scientists who study the ancient climate from geological and biological evidence, has revealed that the period around 2000 to 1700 BCE was marked by a significant shift in the monsoon pattern across South Asia. The monsoon rains that had watered the Indus plains and sustained the agricultural system became weaker and less reliable. Rainfall decreased. The rivers, fed by weakened monsoon rains, became less productive in their flooding patterns. For a civilization that depended so heavily on the reliable annual flood of the Indus and its tributaries, on the predictable renewal of agricultural land that the flood cycle provided, a weakening of the monsoon would have been devastating. Fields that had produced reliable harvests for centuries would have become less productive. The agricultural surplus that sustained the urban population, the surplus that funded the craftsmen and the traders and the administrators, would have declined. And as the surplus declined, the urban population that depended on it would have come under pressure. Cities that could no longer feed their populations would have declined in size. Trade networks that depended on agricultural surplus would have contracted. The administrative systems that maintained the standardization of the material culture would have weakened as the resources to sustain them shrank. The drying of the Gagahakra river system is a particularly significant climatic development. The Gagahakra, which may have been the Sarasvati River of ancient Indian texts, flowed through the most densely settled part of the Indus cultural area. More Harappan sites are located along the Gagahakra drainage than along any other single river system. If this river system dried up or dramatically reduced its flow, as the geological evidence suggests it did around 1900 BCE, the impact on the settlements along its banks would have been severe. Farmers dependent on the river's seasonal flood for their agriculture would have been forced to abandon their fields. Communities that had relied on the river for water would have had to relocate. The drying of the Gagahakra may have triggered the largest single population movement in the Indus Valley decline. A shift of population eastward and southward, away from the dried river valleys toward the Gangetic Plain and the coastal regions of Gujarat where rainfall was more reliable. Indo-Aryan migration and the arrival of new populations from Central Asia, who brought with them the early forms of the Indo-European languages that would eventually become Sanskrit, and the other languages of the Indo-Aryan family, was once proposed as the primary cause of the Indus decline. The image of nomadic invaders sweeping down from the northwest and overwhelming the urban civilization was a compelling narrative. It is also, according to the current weight of evidence, largely incorrect as an explanation for the Indus decline. The archaeological evidence does not support a sudden, violent conquest of the Indus cities. There is no destruction horizon at the major sites of the kind that would indicate military attack. No burned buildings, no mass burials of individuals killed by violence, no abrupt change in the material culture consistent with a replacement of one population by another. The decline was gradual. It was a slow deterioration rather than a sudden fall, and its causes were primarily internal and environmental rather than external and military. The Indo-Aryan migrations did occur. The genetic and linguistic evidence is clear on this. but they occurred over an extended period, probably interacting with a population that was already in decline rather than overwhelming a civilization at its height. The Indus Valley Civilization did not end suddenly. It entered a long twilight, a period that archaeologists call the late Harappan phase, lasting from approximately 1900 to 1300 BCE, during which the great cities were gradually abandoned and the population dispersed into smaller, more rural settlements. The process was uneven. Different parts of the Indus cultural area experienced the transition at different times and in different ways. In the core area of the great cities, the Indus plain of Sindh and southern Punjab, the urban centres declined most rapidly. Mohenjo Daro shows clear evidence of deterioration in its later phases. The street plan disrupted by encroaching construction, the maintenance of the drainage system neglected, the quality of the material culture declining. By approximately 1800 BCE, Mohenjo Daro appears to have been largely abandoned. Harappa persisted somewhat longer, but it too shows the signs of decline. Reduced population, deteriorating urban infrastructure, the gradual disappearance of the features that had defined the mature Harappan city. In the eastern regions, modern Haryana and Rajasthan in India, the picture was different. Here, the archaeological evidence suggests that the population actually increased in the late Harappan period as people migrated eastward from the declining core areas. New settlements appeared in the Gangetic plain. The cultural tradition of the Indus civilization, modified, simplified, but recognizable, persisted in these eastern regions for several centuries after the great cities had been abandoned. The fate of the Indus people, the question of what happened to the millions of individuals who had lived in the great urban centers, is not a mystery in the dramatic sense. They did not disappear, they did not die in mass catastrophes, they moved, they dispersed into the surrounding countryside, they relocated to areas with more reliable water sources, they adopted more flexible, less urban ways of life that were better suited to the changed conditions. The descendants of the Indus Valley people are almost certainly among the ancestors of the modern population of South Asia, mixed over the subsequent 4,000 years with the incoming Indo-Aryan populations and with other migrations and movements, but present in the genetic heritage of the people who live today in India and Pakistan and the neighboring regions. The cultural traditions of the Indus Valley Civilization did not vanish with the cities. Some elements of Indus material culture, specific vessel forms, specific decorative motifs, specific craft techniques, can be traced into the later archaeological record of South Asia, persisting in modified form after the great cities had fallen silent. The religious traditions, the goddess figurines, the ritual bathing practices, the specific animals and symbols that appear on the Indus seals, may have contributed to the later religious traditions of South Asia. The connections between Indus religion and later Hinduism are debated and uncertain, but the possibility that some strands of continuity exist between the ancient civilization and the living religious traditions of the subcontinent is one that serious scholars take seriously. The Indus Valley Civilization did not end, it transformed, it became something else, less visible, less monumental, less archaeologically dramatic, but continuous. The river that sustained it still flows. The people who built the cities are still there, in the genetic heritage of their descendants. The traditions that they developed, the yoga poses that may appear on the Pashupati seal, the ritual bathing that the Great Bath may have served, the reverence for the bull that persists in modern Indian culture, may still be present, transformed and reinterpreted across 4,000 years in the living culture of South Asia. The story of how the modern world discovered the Indus Valley Civilization is itself a fascinating narrative, one that involves colonial archaeology, nationalist politics, accidental discovery, and the patient, painstaking work of generations of scholars. The first archaeological investigations of the Indus sites took place in the early 19th century, when British colonial administrators and military officers exploring the Punjab and Sindh began to notice and describe the large mounds that dotted the landscape. Charles Masson, an English soldier who had deserted from the East India Company's army and was travelling incognito in the Punjab, described the ruins of Harappa in 1829, noting the large mound and the baked bricks that were visible on its surface. His description was recorded but not immediately acted upon. Alexander Cunningham, the founder of the Archaeological Survey of India, visited Harappa in the 1870s and collected some inscribed seals from the site, publishing them without fully understanding their significance. He recognized that the inscriptions were in an unknown script but did not identify the site as part of a major ancient civilization. And then came the railways and the bricks and the inadvertent destruction that we noted at the beginning of this story. The systematic archaeological investigation of the Indus sites began only in the 1920s under the direction of John Marshall, the Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India, who oversaw excavations at both Mohenjo Daro and Harappa simultaneously. The person most responsible for the initial excavations at Mohenjo Daro was R.D. Banerjee, an Indian archaeologist working for the survey who visited the site in 1919 and 1922 and recognized its significance. His reports prompted Marshall to authorize full-scale excavations. The person most responsible for the Harappa excavations was Dayaram Sahni, another Indian archaeologist who began systematic work at the site in 1920. When Marshall announced the discovery of the Indus Valley Civilization to the world in the Illustrated London News in September 1924, he described it as a new chapter in the history of human civilization, language that, for once, was not hyperbole. The subsequent history of Indus Valley archaeology has been shaped inevitably by the political history of the region. The partition of India and Pakistan in 1947 divided the Indus Valley between the two new nations, Mohenjo Daro and Harappa falling within Pakistan, the eastern sites within India. This division has had significant consequences for the pace and organization of archaeological research, creating different national traditions of Indus scholarship in the two countries and complicating collaborative research. Pakistani archaeologists have continued excavations at Mohenjo Daro and Harappa, as well as at Dholavira, though Dholavira is in India, and other sites, while dealing with the complex challenges of preserving sites in a country with limited resources for archaeological conservation. Indian archaeologists have excavated dozens of sites in Rajasthan, Gujarat, Haryana, and other Indian states, discovering a large number of Indus settlements that had not been known to earlier researchers and expanding the known geographic extent of the civilization significantly. The major recent development in Indus Valley archaeology has been the application of ancient DNA analysis to human skeletal remains from the sites. A landmark study published in 2019 using genetic material extracted from an individual buried at Rakhigarhi approximately 4,600 years ago provided the first direct genetic evidence about the biology of the Indus Valley people. The results were significant. The Rakhigarhi individual showed a genetic profile consistent with a South Asian population that had not yet received the major genetic contribution from the Central Asian steppe migrations that occurred in the 2nd millennium BCE. She was genetically what a modern population model would predict for a pre-migration South Asian, descended from the populations that had inhabited the subcontinent since before the Indo-Aryan migrations. This confirms what the archaeological evidence had already suggested. The Indus Valley Civilization was built by people who were native to South Asia, not by migrants from elsewhere. The people of Mohenjo Daro and Harappa were South Asian. Their civilization was indigenous, and their descendants are still there. The Indus Valley Civilization left no pyramids, no Sphinx, no Parthenon, no Colosseum, no monuments of the kind that define the visual vocabulary of ancient civilization in the popular imagination. What it left is less visible and more profound. Urban planning, the concept of the planned city, streets laid out in a grid, buildings arranged to standard dimensions, public and private space systematically organized, is so familiar to us that we no longer think of it as a specific invention with a specific history. But it was invented. Somewhere someone first decided that a city should be organized according to a plan rather than allowed to grow organically in whatever direction seemed convenient at each moment. The Indus Valley cities are the earliest known examples of this invention. The straight streets, the standardized brick sizes, the consistent orientation to the cardinal directions. These are the earliest documented evidence of the planned city in human history. Public sanitation. The concept that a city has a collective responsibility for managing the waste produced by its population. That sewage should be channeled away from residential areas, that drainage should be organized on a city-wide basis, that clean water and clean streets are public goods worth investing in. This concept also had to be invented. It was invented in the Indus Valley. The sewers of Mohenjo Daro, predating Rome by 2,000 years, are the earliest known large-scale urban sanitation system. The people who built them understood something about public health that the Roman world rediscovered much later, and that much of the modern world is still working to implement. Standardized weights and measures. The possibility of reliable commerce over long distances, the kind of trade that connects different regions, that allows surplus in one place to address scarcity in another, that drives the specialization and the exchange of goods that is the foundation of economic growth, depends on a system of measurement that both parties to a transaction can trust. The Indus Valley developed such a system and maintained it across more than 1 million square kilometers, more than 1,000 years before the Mediterranean civilizations that we typically credit with the invention of commercial infrastructure. Cotton. The Indus Valley may have been the original home of cotton cultivation, the place where the plant was first domesticated and where the techniques of spinning and weaving cotton fiber into cloth were first developed. Cotton today is one of the most important agricultural crops in the world. The cotton that clothes billions of people, that fills the markets of the global textile industry, that is woven into the sheets and towels and garments of everyday life across every culture. Its cultivation history traces back, in all probability, to the farms of the ancient Indus plain. Yoga. This is the most speculative of the Indus legacies, and it should be stated with appropriate caution. The figure on the Pashupati seal, seated in what appears to be a meditative posture with the legs crossed and the feet together, resembles the yoga postures that are central to later South Asian religious and physical practice. The connection between this image and the yoga tradition of later Hinduism and Buddhism is not provable from the available evidence, but it is not implausible. The concept of meditative, seated practice of specific bodily postures as vehicles for spiritual experience. This concept may be very old in South Asia, much older than the textual tradition that records it. If the Pashupati seal does represent an early form of meditative practice, then yoga, a seal which today is practiced by hundreds of millions of people across the world, which has become one of the most globally significant contributions of South Asian culture to world civilization, may trace its origins to the banks of the Indus River 5,000 years ago. A century of archaeology has taught us an enormous amount about the Indus Valley Civilization. We know what their cities looked like, how they were organized, what the people ate and wore and used in their daily lives. We know the geographic extent of the civilization, the chronology of its rise and decline, the trade networks it maintained with the rest of the ancient world. We know all of this. And yet, the most important questions remain unanswered. We cannot read their writing. After 100 years of study, after the application of every available tool of linguistics and computational analysis, the Indus script remains undeciphered. The civilization is speaking to us in 4,000 inscribed objects, and we cannot understand a word. What did they believe? What stories did they tell about the gods and the world? What did they call themselves? What did they call their cities? What were the names of the rulers, the merchants, the craftsmen who built and maintained the civilization? We do not know. We do not understand their political organization. How was the civilization governed? Who had authority? How were decisions made? How was the remarkable standardization of the material culture maintained across such a vast area? We do not know. We do not fully understand how they declined. Climate change was a factor, and the evidence is clear on this. But the specific mechanisms by which a changed climate translated into the decline of specific cities, the abandonment of specific sites, the dispersal of specific populations, these mechanisms are still being worked out. The Indus Valley Civilization is, in a very real sense, the world's largest unsolved archaeological mystery. Not in the sense of dramatic speculation. There are no aliens involved, no lost continents, no suppressed truths that the archaeological establishment is concealing. The mystery is genuine and honest, the evidence is extensive but incomplete, the script is real but unreadable, the civilization was sophisticated but has left too little textual record for us to understand its inner life. The mystery is the product of time and taphonomy, of the 4,000 years of decay and burial that stand between us and the people who built these cities, of the specific ways in which organic materials perish while stone and fired clay survive, of the specific accidents of discovery that have left some sites extensively excavated and others barely touched. New work is being done every year. New sites are being discovered. New analytical techniques are being applied. The ancient DNA work is providing information that no previous generation of Indus scholars could access. The mystery is real, but it is not permanent. Somewhere, in the unexcavated portions of Rakhigarhi or Ganweriwala or some other site not yet systematically explored, there may be a bilingual inscription, a text in the Indus script alongside a text in a language that we can read. The key that unlocks 4,000 years of silence, it has not been found yet, but it may be waiting. The Indus River still flows. It has been flowing since before the civilization that bears its name built its first house on its banks. It will be flowing when the last archaeologist has finished their last excavation and written their last paper, and the civilization is known as well as it ever will be. The river does not care about the mystery it created. It flows south from the Tibetan plateau, through the mountains of Kashmir, across the plains of Punjab and Sindh, to the Arabian Sea. It carries the snowmelt of the Himalayas and the monsoon rains of the subcontinent in the same slow, wide, brown flow that it always has. The mounds of the ancient cities are there on its banks, at Mohenjo Daro, at sites whose names we may not yet know, at places where the river has changed its course and left its old banks dry, and the ruins of the settlements that stood on those banks exposed to the slow work of erosion. At Mohenjo Daro, the ruins are visible from the road, the exposed brick walls, the excavated streets, the great bath with its ancient waterproofing still intact after 4,000 years. The site is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, protected in theory, though conservation challenges are significant. The rising groundwater table, the salt crystallization that is slowly destroying the exposed brick surfaces, the limited resources available for preservation in a country with many competing priorities. At Harappa, the modern town of Harappa sits adjacent to the ancient site. The railway line, whose construction in the 1850s used the ancient bricks still passing within sight of the remaining ruins. The people of modern Pakistan and India are the inheritors of this civilization, even if most of them do not think of it that way. The genetic evidence connects them to the Indus people. The cultural evidence, the cotton cultivation, the possible yoga traditions, the reverence for the bull and the elephant and the other animals that appear on the seals, the ritual bathing practices that persist in South Asian religious traditions, may connect them even more directly. The Indus Valley Civilization is not simply the past of South Asia. It may be, in ways that are still being worked out, the foundation. The civilization that built the first planned cities, the first sewage systems, the first standardized weights and measures, the civilization that was the largest in the ancient world, that traded with Mesopotamia and the Persian Gulf, that produced art of extraordinary sophistication and maintained a cultural integration across 1 million square kilometers. This civilization is the beginning of the South Asian story. Its descendants built the civilization that gave the world cotton, zero, chess, yoga, the decimal system, the Upanishads, the Mahabharata, Buddhism, Jainism, and the spice trade that drove European exploration. The Indus Valley Civilization did not end. It became the foundation of something else, something that is still growing. There is a woman in the modern Indian state of Gujarat who makes pottery the way her grandmother made it, who learned the technique from her grandmother, who learned from her grandmother before that. The specific vessel form she makes, the specific way she forms the rim, the specific decoration she applies, the specific firing technique she uses, can be traced back through the generations to pottery forms that appear in the archaeological record of the Indus Valley Civilization. This is not a romantic metaphor. It is a documented ethnographic reality, the subject of serious academic research that has traced specific ceramic traditions in modern South Asian craft communities back to Harappan prototypes. The woman making pottery in Gujarat today is, in a specific technical and cultural sense, practicing a craft tradition that is 5,000 years old. There is a man in the Indian state of Tamil Nadu who practices a form of yoga, specifically a seated meditation practice, that his teacher traces back through an unbroken lineage of teachers extending, in the tradition's own account, to a time before recorded history. Whether the specific lineage is as old as claimed is impossible to verify, but the seated meditation practices of South Asian spiritual traditions, the lotus position, the regulated breathing, the focused attention, may have Indus Valley roots. The Pashupati seal figure, with its apparent meditation posture, is at least suggestive of the antiquity of these practices in the region. There is a farmer in Punjab, on either side of the India-Pakistan border, who grows cotton. The cotton that the Indus Valley people were among the first to cultivate, that their weavers transformed into cloth that travelled to Mesopotamia, that their civilization spread through the ancient world. Cotton is still grown in the Punjab, on the same land, in the same climate, by the descendants of the same people who first domesticated it. The continuity is real, imperfect, disrupted, transformed by 4,000 years of history and migration and conquest and cultural change, but real. The Indus Valley Civilization is not simply an ancient chapter in a book that has been closed for millennia. It is a living root, invisible, underground, but still feeding the tree that grows above it. The 1.4 billion people of India and the 220 million people of Pakistan and the 170 million people of Bangladesh, the nearly 2 billion people of South Asia, are the living continuation of a story that began on the banks of the Indus River 5,000 years ago. They are the children of the mound of the dead, They are the inheritors of the cities that nobody knew existed. They are the descendants of the people who built the first sewers, the first planned streets, the first standardized weights, the people who traded with Mesopotamia and sailed the Arabian Sea and made the carnelian beads that archaeologists still find in the ruins of ancient Ur. The civilization was forgotten, the people were not. It is evening on the Indus plain. The sun is going down over the flat agricultural landscape. The same sun that set over this plain when the bricklayers of Mohenjo Daro were laying the first courses of the Great Bath, when the seal carvers of Harappa were pressing their intricate designs into soft steatite, when the bead makers of Lothal were drilling their impossibly fine holes through carnelian stone. The river is wide and brown and slow in this light. It catches the last of the sun in a ribbon of bronze that stretches from horizon to horizon. The mounds of the ancient cities are shadows in the twilight. Low, irregular shapes on the flat plain, barely distinguishable from the natural topography, except to those who know what they are looking at. 4,000 years of silence lie in those mounds, not the silence of death, not the silence of something that has ended and is gone, the silence of patience, of waiting, of a civilization that built its cities so well with such fired brick and such careful planning that they are still here, still yielding their secrets, still speaking to the people who take the time to listen. The script on the seals is still unread. The governance of the great cities is still unknown. The language of the Indus people is still unheard. But the sewers still drain. The Great Bath is still watertight. The brick walls of Mohenjo Daro still stand. The standardized weights still measure accurately. The carnelian beads still glow with the specific red of ancient Gujarat stone. The Indus Valley Civilization is present in every piece of cotton cloth you have ever worn, in every glass of clean water you have ever drunk from a city's clean supply, in every straight street you have ever walked down in a planned neighborhood, in every commercial transaction conducted with standardized weights and measures, in every breath drawn in a yoga class, in every seated meditation, in every moment of stillness and inward attention. They built the future, these people on the Indus plain. They built it so well that we are still living in it. And they left us a mystery, written in a script we cannot read, on seals we hold in our hands but cannot understand, that may be the most profound invitation to humility that the ancient world has to offer. We do not know everything. We cannot read every inscription. We cannot understand every civilization, but we can look, we can dig, we can listen. And sometimes, in the silence between what we know and what we do not know, something speaks. The river speaks, 5,000 years old and still moving, still carrying the snowmelt of the Himalayas to the Arabian Sea, still flowing past the mounds where the first planned cities lie waiting. Rest now, the Indus is still flowing. The same river that watered the fields of Mohenjo Daro, the same water that filled the Great Bath, the same current that carried the trading ships of Lothal toward the open sea. Still here, still moving, still patient. Good night.